Number 12. Expanding dum-dum bullets. The bullet that was built to stop a man by tearing him open. A man is running straight at you through dust and rifle smoke. You fire a .303 round center mass. He jerks, but he does not stop. One bullet punches a clean, narrow hole and leaves his momentum untouched. That failure helped trigger one of the most controversial weapon bans inherited by World War II. In the 1890s, at the dum-dum arsenal near Calcutta, British officers changed the bullet itself. They exposed the soft lead nose. They hollowed it. They made it open inside the body instead of slipping through. The result was immediate, intimate, and horrifying. Wounds widened. Reports spread. By July 29, 1899, diplomats at The Hague outlawed bullets that expand or flatten easily in the human body. The pattern would repeat across the history of banned weapons in World War II. The tools that solve battlefield problems fastest were often the ones nations rushed to forbid, or quietly kept close at hand. Now come in closer. It is 1896. The light inside the dum-dum arsenal is flat and white with heat. Calcutta lies to the south. The frontier is far away, but the problem is already here, carried in paper reports, surgeons' notes, and the dry language of officers who have watched men absorb a rifle hit and keep coming. Captain Neville Bertie Clay stands over a bench with a .303 cartridge between his fingers. Brass case, cordite charge, a neat jacketed bullet at the tip. It is a small thing, cleanly made, modern. It flies fast, it feeds well, it pierces. That is the problem. On the northwest frontier, the old big rounds had struck like hammers. This one, with its hard metal jacket and smaller caliber, can drill straight through flesh, leave a narrow wound, and carry on. The man in front of the rifle drops eventually. Maybe. But not now. Not before he closes another 10 yards. Not before he swings a blade. Not before someone else dies. So Bertie Clay and the ordnance men do not redesign the rifle. They redesign the injury. The bench is covered with tools. A file, a knife edge, a row of cartridges. One bullet has the jacket trimmed back to expose the lead at the nose. Another is hollowed at the tip. Later patterns follow. These are experiments from 1895 onward. Not one single miracle round, but several attempts at the same ugly answer. Make the front soft. Make it unstable in flesh. Make impact do more than puncture. They load one. The rifle cracks. Recoil drives into the shoulder. Smoke drifts. The target is struck. The effect is not subtle. The nose does not stay pointed. It spreads. Mushrooms. Sometimes the jacket peels. Sometimes the lead deforms and tears a wound far wider than the bullet's original diameter. The bullet stops acting like a needle. Inside the body, it becomes something blunter, heavier, more ruinous. The difference is visible at once. A full metal jacket round can enter and exit with 2 holes. The expanding round enters small and leaves chaos. Muscle is ripped instead of parted. Bone is smashed differently. A surgeon no longer writes about a channel. He writes about a cavity. Fragments, tissue pulped around the path. The language hardens because it has to. These are not better wounds. They are more effective wounds. So the cartridges keep moving. Crates leave the arsenal. Ports move with them. The name follows too. Dum-dum. First a place outside Calcutta, then a nickname, then a warning. Officers talk about stopping power. Doctors talk about mutilation. They are describing the same bullet from opposite ends of the operating table. By 1897 and 1899, newer British Mark IV and Mark V .303 designs use hollow point forms that behave in much the same way. This is no longer a one-off colonial improvisation. It is a family of ammunition taking shape around a single demand. If a man is charging, the bullet must make him stop. Now. Not after he has already reached you. Then the scene shifts. June 1899. The Hague. No heat haze, no arsenal bench, no frontier dust. Delegates sit in dark coats with papers stacked on polished tables. and the same bullet sits invisibly in the room between them. Sir John Ardaugh argues Britain's military case. He does not describe cruelty for its own sake. He describes necessity. Men had been hit and kept advancing. Officers needed something more decisive. The Empire's frontier had produced a technical fix, and Britain wanted the right to keep it. Around the table, other delegates hear something else. A bullet deliberately altered to expand or flatten inside the human body does not cause suffering by accident. The suffering is engineered. The words become careful because the stakes are not. They are not banning all rifle bullets. They are narrowing in on one behavior: expansion, flattening, easy deformation in the body. Not the name, not dum-dum as slang. The mechanism, the effect. A rule written tightly enough to catch the thing everyone in the room now understands. Outside, armies are modernizing. Empires are armed. Everyone present knows Europe is filling with conscript rifles and industrial ammunition. What began as a colonial answer to a colonial battlefield is pulled upward into international law before it can spread further. The vote goes against Britain. In parliamentary discussion that June, it is noted the Commission condemned the bullet with only 2 dissenting votes. The room has moved. Whatever officers on the frontier wanted, the diplomats are no longer willing to let that logic travel unchecked into wars between states. Then comes the date that sticks. July 29, 1899. The Declaration is adopted. Bullets which expand or flatten easily in the human body are prohibited. The cartridge on Bertie Clay's workbench changes status. It is still brass, still lead, still jacket and powder and primer. Now it carries a stigma that outlives the empire that argued for it. Germany accedes on September 4, 1900. Japan on October 6, 1900. Great Britain and Ireland on August 13, 1907. The years pass. Armies standardize around full metal jacket ammunition. The nickname survives longer than the exact design. Dum-dum stops meaning one arsenal's experiment and becomes shorthand for a bullet the law has marked out as beyond the line. So when World War II arrives, no one can claim surprise. This is not a fresh outrage discovered in that war. It is an inherited taboo already sitting in the rules, already loaded with memory from the 1890s, already understood by soldiers, lawyers, and quartermasters for what it is supposed to do inside a body. You are back behind the rifle for a second. Dust in the throat, front sight trembling. A man is still running at you. The appeal of the thing is obvious. Solve the immediate problem by turning the wound itself into the weapon. Not a shell, not a gas. A bullet that opened like a flower on impact. Number 11. Explosive rifle bullets. On December 11, 1868, diplomats in St. Petersburg put a number into law: 400 grams. Anything below that weight, if it was explosive or inflammable, was not supposed to be used in war between the states that signed. The logic was brutally specific. A normal rifle round could already put a soldier out of the fight. A tiny projectile that exploded inside soft tissue did something else. It multiplied suffering without adding a military necessity the law was willing to accept. The Declaration had a target in mind. Russian military authorities had developed an impact-exploding bullet in 1863, and by 1867, it had been altered so it would burst on contact with a soft substance. That was the line they tried to draw before the technology spread. 71 years later, on March 6, 1940, one Finnish soldier learned what that line looked like when it broke. Near Ulismainen, south of the Kola River, Simo Hauha was not lying alone in a snow hide, picking off targets one by one. By then, he was acting as a squad leader in a Finnish counterattack. The winter war had only days left, but that did not matter on the ground. The forest was still white. The cold was still savage. Men still had to stand up and move through it under fire. Hauha was already famous. He was already the sniper the Soviets feared, the kind of name newspapers turned into legend. On that day, none of that protected bone. A Soviet soldier hit him in the face with an explosive bullet. Not the shoulder, not the hand, the face. The round smashed his jaw and tore through the left side of it with such force that later reports said half his face was gone. Dropped, and for a while, the story became death. Newspapers reported him dead. On a battlefield like Kola, that made sense. A rifle caliber hit to the face is catastrophic, even before you add the feature the 1868 Declaration was written to stop. You can survive a clean penetration. You are not meant to survive a bullet that enters soft tissue and then comes apart in fire and pressure. Hague did survive. He was found, evacuated, and kept alive through a recovery that lasted years. The Kola and Simo Hague Museum says he underwent more than 25 facial operations. More than 25. That number tells its own story. This was not one wound, stitched and closed. It was reconstruction. Bone, teeth, tissue, breathing, eating, speech, appearance. Each had to be fought for piece by piece. Explosive rifle bullets were easy to hide behind paperwork. By World War II, the category had not disappeared. It had blurred. Read wartime intelligence instead of treaty language, and you can watch the legal fiction form in real time. German 7.92mm observation rounds were identified by U.S. intelligence as bullets containing smoke-producing and explosive elements. Officially, that gave them a technical role. Observation, spotting, see where the rounds land, adjust fire, use them against aircraft, perhaps against light materiel, perhaps in roles where the visible strike mattered as much as the hit itself. On paper, they were not simply anti-personnel bullets designed to burst inside a man. Bullets do not stay on paper. The same caliber, 7.92mm, was the standard German rifle and machine gun round. If a special cartridge exists in a common caliber, the gray zone opens immediately. A round justified for aircraft can be chambered in a rifle. A cartridge boxed for ranging can travel in ordinary ammunition supply. A weapon described as meant for material can be pointed at flesh in half a second. The law cared about purpose. The battlefield cared about what was loaded when the target appeared. Japanese ammunition made the problem harder to ignore. U.S. intelligence in the Southwest Pacific reported Japanese 7.7mm and 7.92mm explosive and incendiary small arms rounds, some found in 5-round clips. 5-round clips matter. They are not the packaging of some laboratory curiosity. They suggest ammunition moving through the habits of infantry use, stripped into rifles, carried by soldiers, available in the ordinary tempo of ground combat. One U.S. report said a Japanese explosive bullet could blow a 3-inch hole in aircraft duralumin sheet. There is the official rationale in one sentence: anti-aircraft, anti-materiel. A technical cartridge for metal skins and moving targets. Hague was not an airplane. His wound strips the category back to the body. The St. Petersburg Declaration did not ban these bullets because they were dramatic or because diplomats had suddenly become gentle. It banned them because if an ordinary bullet could disable a soldier, then building a tiny explosive charge into rifle caliber crossed into calculated aggravation of the wound. The principle can sound antique until you look south of the Kola River. Then it sounds clinical, precise. They saw the mechanism coming in 1868. Hague lived through its proof in 1940. What was the contradiction? Armies in the Second World War did not usually announce, "We are issuing outlawed anti-personnel explosive bullets." They did not need to. They had cleaner labels ready. Spotting round, observation round, incendiary round, aircraft use, anti-materiel use. A specialized cartridge with a specialized purpose, so the ban could remain on the books while the ammunition remained in circulation. Not abolished, not admitted. Reassigned. That convenience is hard to miss. A weapon can be present and deniable at the same time. If it punches into aluminum, it is technical. If it enters a man, it is an exception. If too many men report the same kind of wound, the record turns foggy because intent is harder to prove than damage. The law asks what the bullet was for. The body records what it did. Hague woke from his coma on March 13, 1940, the day peace was declared. The timing lands almost too neatly. The war stops the day the shattered face opens its eyes. He would live for decades afterward, but not as the untouched marksman of early Winter War legend. The wound stayed with him for life. So did the evidence. One rifle bullet, one man. More than 25 operations. Behind that single shot runs a chain back to 1863, to 1867, to December 11, 1868, to a treaty that recognized the problem before most of the world had even standardized modern rifles. The label changed. The effect did not. Hit in the face by an explosive bullet. Number 10. Poisoned bullets. On September 11, 1944, inside Sachsenhausen concentration camp, SS Dr. Joachim Mrugowski stood over 5 condemned men laid out horizontally and prepared to test a rumor. Not in the trench, not on a battlefield, in a controlled shooting with doctors watching. The men were later identified in the judgment as Russian prisoners of war. Each was shot once in the upper left thigh with a 7.65 millimeter projectile packed with crystallized aconitine nitrate. About 33 to 38 milligrams per bullet, depending on the trial document. Small caliber, small dose. The claim behind this weapon was simple. A poisoned bullet would add certainty, hit the target, and chemistry would finish what the metal began. But the Sachsenhausen notes record something colder. 2 rounds passed through cleanly. No poisoning followed. No useful result. Those 2 men were removed from observation like failed samples. That leaves 3 bodies. The setup already tells you what this was. A normal rifle bullet kills by trauma, blood loss, shock, organ damage if it hits the right place. These shots were aimed elsewhere. Upper left thigh, a heavy muscle, a place chosen not for instant destruction, but for circulation. The poison had to remain in the body long enough to enter the bloodstream. The projectile did not replace the wound. It relied on the wound staying survivable for a time. If the victim dies too fast, the test fails. Now the poison. Aconitine is a plant alkaloid, violent in tiny quantities, not an industrial gas, not an artillery filling. Something older. That makes the case stranger. By 1944, armies had tanks, rockets, and high explosives that tore bodies apart. Inside a camp laboratory system, men in white coats went back to poison on projectiles. The ban on poisoned weapons was older than most modern rifles. The taboo did not begin with gas over Flanders. In 1675, Strasbourg produced what the OPCW describes as the first international agreement limiting chemical weapons, and poison bullets were there from the start. Then, on October 18, 1907, Hague Convention 4, Article 23A, prohibited poison or poisoned weapons. By the time these 5 prisoners were shot, this was old law, not a gray zone. The surviving trial material records the progression with the dryness of a lab notebook. Salivation, choking, vomiting, loss of reflexes, motor agitation, circulatory collapse. Not instant, not cinematic, a delayed breakdown. The 3 men died after 121, 123, and 129 minutes. Just over 2 hours. Those numbers carry the point. An ordinary execution by firearm is counted in seconds or minutes. Here, the doctors watched a process. They waited for symptoms. They measured a reaction. The bullet served as the delivery system. At Nuremberg, Mrugowski tried to frame this as an execution. Condemned men being shot, nothing more. The tribunal rejected that version. The details were too exact, too clinical. 5 prisoners, same place on the body, same caliber, same poison. Symptoms observed and recorded. A top-secret report sent the next day, September 12, 1944, from Berlin-Zehlendorf to Dr. Albert Wittmann's Criminological Institute. Executions do not usually produce test conditions and secret technical correspondence about dosage performance. Experiments do. The fantasy version of a poisoned bullet is a super round. One hit, guaranteed death. Efficient and terrifying. The Sachsenhausen record shows something clumsier. 2 projectiles passed through and failed to poison at all. The method only worked if the bullet lodged or released enough toxin into tissue. That is a forensic problem, not a battlefield miracle. The projectile had to wound in a very specific way. Too clean and it behaved like an ordinary bullet. Stay inside and poisoning began. The weapon was conditional. That helps explain why people kept trying. A bullet that hides poison inside itself blurs cause of death. The wound looks small. Death comes later by a mechanism that can be mislabeled or buried under infection, shock, or ordinary trauma. In a war where states often tried to ban or conceal the most effective methods, that ambiguity had value. Not because it was cleaner, because it was harder to prove. There was already a pretext waiting. Witness Eugen Kogan testified that SS men claimed the Soviets had used poison bullets. He called the story pure imagination. The phrase matters, pure imagination. The sources record the allegation, but they do not verify any Soviet poison bullet incident behind it. The trail runs in a harder direction, not from enemy atrocity to emergency investigation, but from rumor to human test. Not evidence first, prisoners first. By August 19, 1947, the Nuremberg medical trial judgment found Rogovsky guilty under counts 2, 3, and 4. Even there, the judgment matters less as moral commentary than as classification. It rejected the idea that this was merely a firing squad with paperwork. The court treated it as the record described it, a criminal experiment to test poisoned bullets as a method of killing. The law had named the category centuries earlier. Sachsenhausen supplied the demonstration. Read the demonstration like a case file. 5 men shot, 2 excluded because the rounds passed through. 3 observed because the poison took hold. Same thigh, same caliber, same toxin. Death at 121, 123, and 129 minutes. A spread of only 8 minutes from first to last. Not chaos, not battlefield confusion. A timed series. The sensational claim was that poisoned bullets belonged to wartime legend. The evidence is narrower and worse. They were real enough to test, illegal enough to hide, and unreliable enough that the testers needed living bodies to see whether the chemistry would stay in the wound. On September 12, 1944, Rogowski sat down in Berlin-Zehlendorf and typed the results for Widman. 3 deaths, 2 failures. A secret report moved from one desk to another, carrying the last 2 hours of 5 men's lives in a few clinical lines. Then the paper leaves Sachsenhausen. The clock is still running. Number 9. Tear gas shells. On January 31, 1915, near Bolomo on the Eastern Front, German artillery crews loaded about 18,000 shells with liquid xylobromide and fired them at Russian lines. Not high explosive, not shrapnel. A chemical irritant built for a simpler job. Get into eyes, nose, throat, lungs, and turn a trench position into a place men could not stay in. But the temperature was too low. The liquid did not vaporize properly in the winter air. The attack failed almost absurdly. 18,000 shells were not enough when the chemistry stayed inside the casing or fell uselessly into the snow. Start with the mechanism. A tear gas shell does not rely on blast as the main weapon. The metal body is just delivery. The burster charge only opens the shell and spreads the fill. The damage begins after detonation, when the agent turns into droplets, vapor, or contaminated smoke in air men have to breathe. If the fill disperses properly, nobody has to die for the position to be neutralized. Vision goes first. Eyes clamp shut. Breathing turns shallow, then ragged. Mucus runs. Coughing cuts off speech. A dugout, bunker, trench bay, cave, or pillbox stops functioning because the men inside cannot see, cannot aim, and cannot stay. That is the key difference. Tear gas sat at the lower end of chemical warfare, but lower hides what it was for. Not mass death on the phosgene scale, not skin destruction on the mustard scale. Disruption, flushing, panic, forced movement. Fire a shell into a confined position and the protection flips. A trench that sheltered you a second ago becomes the place holding the cloud around your face. The shell does not need to kill the crew, only needs to drive them out into rifle fire, machine guns, or high explosive. The numbers show how military planners treated that role. In a 1944 U.S. War Department handbook describing Japanese chemical munitions, the color code appears with the neatness of warehouse inventory. Green bands, tear gas. Yellow, blister gas. Red, vomiting gas. Blue, choking gas. Brown, blood and nerve poisons. 5 colors, 5 functions. Not improvisation on a battlefield, a catalog. Tear gas sits there as one slot in a complete chemical system, marked so crews could identify shell type fast, stack it, move it, and fire it under pressure. The same handbook gets more precise. A Japanese tear gas candle is listed at 7.2 inches long, 2.2 inches in diameter, and about 0.5 pound, filled with a CN mixture. Those are small numbers, smaller than most people imagine when they hear chemical weapon. That is the clue. You do not need a large munition when the target is air in an enclosed space. Half a pound is enough when the weapon is not trying to blow a wall down. It is trying to make the air behind the wall turn on whoever is breathing it. June 17, 1925. The Geneva Protocol is signed. February 8, 1928. It enters into force. Its language bars wartime use of asphyxiating, poisonous, or other gases. The wording had to stay broad. Once a shell bursts and a cloud starts moving, the man on the receiving end does not get a legal footnote. He sees gas. His officers see gas. Masks go on, alarms sound. The calculation is immediate, not whether this shell is merely lacrimatory, but whether lethal agents are coming next. That is the escalatory logic. Gas was not feared because it was the deadliest gas on the battlefield. It was feared because gas, under fire, stops being a tidy category. A green-banded shell and a yellow-banded shell may sit as separate entries in an ordnance manual. Inside a trench line, under bombardment, with visibility breaking down and men choking behind masks, that distinction does not hold steady. If one side starts firing milder chemical shells, the other side has every reason to assume worse agents may follow. Once that assumption sets in, the barrier holding back phosgene, mustard, and later nerve agents gets thin very quickly. A shell that looked limited in a manual carried a much larger strategic risk in practice. The ban did not end the story. It pushed it into labeling, ambiguity, and selective use. In China, Japanese chemical shelling continued during the Second World War. Historian Seiya Matsuno later found a 1939 Japanese battalion report from Shanxi that records ordered gas shell use with ledger-like precision. July 6th, 31 red shells. July 17th, 60 red and 28 yellow. July 18th, 140 red and 20 yellow. 3 dates, 3 entries. 279 chemical shells accounted for in a few lines of reporting. The pattern matters. 31, then 88, then 160. This is not rumor. It is ammunition expenditure. The numbers also expose the classification problem. Red in the 1944 U.S. Handbook indicates vomiting gas. Yellow indicates blister gas. Green indicates tear gas. So when wartime or later accounts use broad labels like poison gas or special smoke, the record turns slippery. Some attacks grouped together in public memory may have involved true tear agents, may have involved sternutators or vomiting agents. Some may have involved blister gas. The records prove chemical shell use. They do not always preserve the exact identity cleanly enough for a simple label to survive. That ambiguity helped these weapons persist. The same family of compounds could slide between categories depending on delivery and context. Under the Modern Chemical Weapons Convention, a riot control agent is defined as a chemical that produces rapid sensory irritation or disabling physical effects that disappear shortly after exposure ends. But Article 1 draws the line sharply. States parties must not use riot control agents as a method of warfare. Same chemistry, same immediate effect, a different legal identity the moment it is fired as a battlefield weapon. So read tear gas shells the way you read all the other banned weapons in this war, by function, not by comforting vocabulary. If a shell is built to burst over enemy troops and fill their position with a chemical that blinds, chokes, and drives them out, the battlefield does not care whether someone filed it under tear instead of blister. The shell still turns air into ammunition. It still creates panic. It still pressures the other side to answer gas with gas. Officially, tear gas could be framed as the lesser chemical weapon, the one that cleared positions without the industrial slaughter attached to mustard or phosgene. On the battlefield, that distinction collapsed the instant the shell burst. Treaties tried to separate the categories with wording. War fused them back together in one reflex: mask on, gas alarm, escalate. The official version said non-lethal irritant. The practical version was simpler and more dangerous. A chemical shell had gone off, and every man in range had to assume the next one could be worse. Number 8. Phosgene gas shells. In July 2006, a joint Chinese-Japanese expert team dug into a scrap site in Ning'an, in northeast China, roughly 200 yards from a junior high school near the Russian border. Old metal had been brought there for years, bent steel, rusted cylinders, the kind of debris people stop examining. Buried inside that heap were Japanese World War II chemical munitions. By the time the excavation was reported, the team had unearthed 689 shells and bombs. 210 contained poison agents, including mustard gas, lewisite, phosgene, and other toxins. They were sealed and moved into temporary storage for destruction. If those casings had been cut open for scrap, cracked by corrosion, or hauled away by people who did not know what blue meant in the old Japanese Army code, a banned battlefield gas could have reached a schoolyard 6 decades after the war ended. Phosgene does not stay in 1945. It sits in the ground and waits. In the former Japanese Army system, phosgene sat under blue, a pulmonary agent. Not a blister agent like mustard. Not the arsenical skin and lung chaos of lewisite. Blue meant lungs. You inhale it, and it goes after the tissue that has to pass oxygen into blood every second you stay alive. The chemistry is carbonyl dichloride, CAS 75-44-5, now listed by the OPCW as a Schedule III toxic chemical. The label sounds clinical. The effect is not. This gas was built to make breathing itself the injury. The Ning'an discovery hit so hard because the containers could look ordinary once buried in mud and scrap. A 75mm shell, around 5 to 6 kilograms. A 90mm mortar shell, also 5 to 6. A 105mm shell, 16 kilograms. 150mm shell, 32 kilograms. These are not treaty abstractions. They are objects small enough to carry, large enough to kill, and tough enough to outlast governments. When Japan's collapsing forces in 1945 buried chemical weapons in China, dumped them in rivers, or simply abandoned them, they left a delayed hazard field across another country. Phosgene also sat in one of the strangest legal positions of the war. On June 17, 1925, the Geneva Protocol was signed. It prohibited the use in war of asphyxiating, poisonous, and other gases. Use in war. That wording mattered. It did not yet comprehensively ban development, production, stockpiling, or transfer. So the weapon was publicly condemned and quietly kept. Outlawed in one sense, tolerated in another. That gray zone is where militaries hide what they do not want to surrender. If a weapon is too notorious to defend in public, but still too useful to abandon, it does not vanish. It moves into inventories, depots, coded categories, and contingency plans. This helps answer the larger question running through all of this. Why were the weapons that worked best so often the ones they tried hardest to ban or bury? Because banning the moment of use is easier than giving up the advantage. The shell stays, the doctrine stays, the factory stays. Only the language gets cleaner. With phosgene, that cleaner language could be especially deceptive. Japanese records classify it as blue, but they also note that white smoke agent was used in mixture with blue. Battlefield delivery could blur the line between smoke and lethal gas. A shell lands, it bursts. Men see cloud before they understand poison. That delay matters. Visibility and identification decide survival time. If soldiers read the round as concealment first and chemical attack second, those seconds are enough. You do not need long when the lungs are the target. Picture the practical scenario these shells were built for. Not a giant cinematic gas wave rolling over no man's land like 1915. Something tighter, more artillery-shaped. A battery fires into a trench line, a bunker mouth, a village edge, a gun pit. The casing bursts, and the cloud settles where men have to stay. You can run from shrapnel if you have room. You cannot stop breathing while you wait out a chemical shell. A man may think he got lucky. He may still be on his feet. He may even keep moving. Inside the chest, the damage has already started. Phosgene shells belong on this list even though the historical record is maddeningly incomplete about how many were actually fired in China. Many records were destroyed. Later discoveries often group phosgene together with mustard, lewisite, and other agents. The paperwork blurs. The munitions keep surfacing. The Federation of American Scientists has estimated roughly 700,000 abandoned Japanese chemical munitions in China. Chemistry World reported more than 50,000 Japanese chemical projectiles, mortars, bombs, drums, and gas pots found at over 90 sites, including agents such as phosgene. Those numbers are not a footnote. They are the weapons still hanging around after the war. That afterlife exposes the loophole better than any courtroom could. If the world had truly shut the weapon down in 1925, there would not have been stockpiles to bury in 1945. But there were. Lots of them. The Geneva Protocol drew one bright moral line and left the warehouse behind it in shadow. Only on April 29, 1997, when the Chemical Weapons Convention entered into force, did the law move beyond battlefield use to ban development, production, stockpiling, transfer, and use. Same family of horror. A much later effort to close the door all the way. By then, the old shells had already spent half a century underground. So phosgene gas shells are not just another example of chemical warfare. They show how a banned weapon can survive by changing status without changing substance. Call it a reserve. Call it deterrence. Call it a coded blue munition mixed with smoke. If it bursts, the lungs still get the same message. Years later, that message was still waiting in the soil near Ning'an. The experts found it under scrap metal, less than a football field's throw from a school. They sealed the shells, moved them into temporary storage, and planned their destruction. Even in cleanup, the danger had to be housed a while longer before anyone could make it disappear. The lasting image is not the battlefield burst. It is a shell sitting intact in dark earth for 60 years, a few hundred yards from children, waiting for a shovel. Number 7. Lewisite gas shells. On January 17, 2012, at Deseret Chemical Depot in Utah, workers rolled the last 2-ton containers of lewisite toward an incinerator. Not shells this time, bulk agent. It belonged to another era, but the danger was current enough that the operation still ran under full chemical weapons protocol. 4 days later, on January 21st, the depot's declared stockpile was gone. Start with that document, a destruction record for a weapon many people assume disappeared with the trenches of the First World War. The odd part is not that lewisite survived that long. The odd part is how little of it appears in one of the places where you would expect to find it plainly, the World War II shell ledger. Open the U.S. Army production tables for 4.2-inch chemical mortar ammunition, the standard American delivery system kept ready for a gas war that mostly never came. One shell weighed 18 pounds with fuse. About 7 of those pounds could be chemical agent. A small steel cylinder could become a contamination event. Now read down the wartime fills from 1940 to 1946. Mustard, 540,746 shells. Phosgene, 49,402. CNS, 41,353. CNB, 12,957. Lewisite, 175. Not 175,000, 175. The number is so small, it almost looks like a typo. Lewisite had a fearsome reputation. It was first produced in 1918, too late for World War I. It was a blister agent built around arsenic. The CDC description is brutally plain. Symptoms can begin in seconds to minutes. Redness can appear within 15 to 30 minutes. Blisters come later. It burns immediately. It attacks the eyes, the skin, the lungs. Low ground, where heavier vapors can linger, it offered something commanders crave and diplomats dread: area denial that keeps working after the burst. So why does a gas this nasty show up in the shell record as a statistical ghost? The ledger does not explain itself. That is what makes it useful. It gives you the hardware with confidence, but not the intention behind the number. The 4.2-inch mortar was real. The authorized fills were real. At the start of the war, lewisite sat on the approved list beside mustard, phosgene, and choking or irritant mixtures. The Army had a tube, a shell, a fuse, and a toxic payload ready to go. But when factories filled shells in serious quantity, they chose something else. That matters more than any slogan. In World War II, the issue was not just whether a gas was illegal to use. Since June 17, 1925, the Geneva Protocol had already pushed poison gas beyond the pale in warfare, and it entered into force on February 8, 1928. But that ban targeted use. It did not erase stockpiles. It did not halt development. It did not empty arsenals. The question underneath these weapons stays the same. Why were the weapons that worked best so often the ones states tried hardest to ban or bury? Lewisite gives a crooked answer. It worked well enough to keep, not well enough to dominate. Mustard had persistence. Phosgene had its own proven lethality. Lewisite had immediate pain and arsenic chemistry, but the production choices suggest it never became the practical battlefield favorite of the American gas arsenal. Those 175 filled shells may have been reserve rounds, a limited lot, or an accounting category touching test or marginal production. Army history gives the number, but not the full roll. The shell record reads like a witness statement with one line missing. Absence can count as evidence. If a military truly believes a weapon will decide the battlefield, it does not make 175 of them across 6 years while manufacturing more than 500,000 mustard rounds. It makes trainloads. It builds doctrine around them. It teaches crews to live with them. Lewisite never reached that point in U.S. mortar ammunition. It remained authorized, feared, and available in reserve, but the ledger suggests it stayed at the edge of practical use, not at the center. You can almost see the bureaucracy holding two positions at once. Keep it because a gas war might start tomorrow. Minimize it because other agents fit better, or because using any of them could trigger retaliation nobody wanted. Lewisite sat in that cold space between readiness and reluctance. Legal to possess under the old rules, toxic enough to terrify, but not the shell they filled by the hundreds of thousands. That makes the artifact at Deseret more revealing than the wartime totals. By 1993, the Chemical Weapons Convention had finally closed the loophole the Geneva Protocol left open. Not just use, development, stockpiling, retention, the whole chain. Lewisite was put on Schedule 1, the short list of chemicals considered to have few or no peaceful uses and a direct connection to warfare. In the OPCW schedules, it sits there with a dry identifier, Lewisite 1, CAS 541-25-3, as if a registry number could domesticate what the substance actually does. The law arrived decades after the shell tables were typed, so the afterlife became the real battlefield. Storage, leakage, disposal, sea dumping. After World War II, about 40,000 tons of chemical munitions containing roughly 15,000 tons of agents were dumped in the Baltic Sea. Lewisite's arsenic chemistry made that legacy especially ugly. Even when it was never fired, it still had to be hidden, sunk, guarded, catalogued, or burned. The weapon kept doing damage by refusing to end cleanly. The shell count alone cannot show that. A weapon does not have to dominate combat to become a national burden. Sometimes it is enough that it is dangerous, stockpiled, and inconvenient to admit. A few pounds in an 18-pound mortar shell could maim on contact. Tons in storage could haunt policy for generations. Lewisite shells matter less as a story of battlefield use than as a story of what states keep in reserve when they want the threat without the detonation. That reserve status explains how banned weapons survive. Not gone, not deployed. Waiting. The 1925 rule said, "Do not use poison gas in war," but it left governments room to warehouse the idea. The weapon could remain official, manufactured in some form, and terrifying by design, while public memory quietly downgraded it to an artifact. Deseret proved otherwise in 2012. Workers were still destroying it. Look back at the wartime production table and the 175 Lewisite shells stop looking trivial. They look like a fingerprint. Proof that Lewisite was inside the system, but never fully trusted by the system that kept it. Not absent, not central. A poison held in reserve until the law finally came for the reserve itself. 4 days, 2 containers. 1 declared stockpile erased. Number 6. Mustard gas shells. December 2, 1943, Bari, Italy. It is 7:20 p.m. and you are standing on a crowded quay under full blackout rules that are not really blackout rules anymore because the port is glowing. Ships are packed hull to hull, cargo sits exposed, light spills across the water. Then the German aircraft come in. You hear the first detonations before you understand what you are hearing. Anti-aircraft fire, screaming metal. Then ships start burning in a line across the harbor. One freighter erupts, another follows. Fuel pours into the basin. Men jump overboard because fire behind you and water below you is supposed to be an easy choice. It is not. Out there, among the Liberty ships, is the SS John Harvey. It looks ordinary, an American freighter. Nothing about it tells the men on the docks or in the hospitals what it is really carrying. Inside are roughly 2,000 sulfur mustard bombs, each loaded with around 60 to 70 pounds of agent. Not for immediate use. Not for this night. They were kept in the Mediterranean as a retaliatory reserve in case Germany used gas first. That loophole had been there all along. On June 17, 1925, the Geneva Protocol said, "Do not use poison gas in war." It did not erase the stockpile. Governments kept the weapons anyway, buried on paper, parked in ports, waiting. Only a small circle knew what was aboard John Harvey, so unloading her was not treated like an emergency. That quiet decision sat in the harbor until the raid found it. Nearby ships are already exploding when John Harvey is hit. Fire reaches ammunition. The freighter blows apart. Everyone on board is killed. Casings rupture and scatter through water already slick with fuel oil. The harbor is no longer just burning, it is contaminated. The men who jumped to save themselves are now swimming through a chemical film that clings to skin, uniforms, hair, life jackets. Oil traps the mustard against the body. Wet cloth holds it in place. You do not feel the full injury right away. That delay is exactly what makes mustard so vicious. At first, some of it looks survivable. Then the survivors start coming in. They are coughing, half-blind, soaked in oil, covered in what doctors assume are ordinary burns from the raid. Hospitals fill fast. Bari is already overloaded from the attack itself, but the strange part comes later. Men who seemed stable begin getting worse. Skin reddens, then blisters. Eyes swell shut. Throats and lungs begin to fail. Cases that should make sense do not. Some patients have little visible damage at first, but collapse anyway. Others arrive coated in oil and clothes that no one realizes are still poisoning them. Doctors treat fire burns. They wash what they can. They move fast. But they are solving the wrong problem, because no one has told them there was gas in the harbor. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart F. Alexander, a U.S. Army chemical warfare physician, is sent to investigate, a real specialist. He notices details that do not fit ordinary blast casualties: the delay, the eye injuries, the pattern of blistering, the respiratory damage. Then the deeper signs, damage that suggests mustard exposure, not just on the skin, but in the body's blood-forming tissues. Alexander works backward through the wreckage, the patient charts, the timing, the ships in the harbor, reaches the answer the authorities do not want spoken aloud. The source was John Harvey. That mattered for the wounded. Decontamination should have happened sooner. Clothing should have been stripped and isolated. Exposure should have been recognized before the blisters fully came up. It also mattered politically. If the Allies admitted what exploded in Bari, they would be admitting that they had chemical munitions pre-positioned in theater, not using them, but storing them, ready if the war crossed that line. So the truth stays locked down. The casualty numbers still wobble because secrecy wrecks arithmetic. One military summary gives 628 mustard casualties and 69 deaths in the first 2 weeks. Another account, drawn from later review of Alexander's work, says over 600 were treated and 83 died. Civilian deaths were never cleanly counted. Records were incomplete. Some victims were evacuated. Some were misdiagnosed. Some were folded into the general chaos of the air raid. Even now, the censorship still sits on the numbers like a thumb. The scale is not in doubt. This was one ship, one secret cargo, one night. Hundreds of men were poisoned without a single formal gas attack being announced over the battlefield. That is what breaks the clean, legal story people like to imagine. You picture a nation deciding to fire gas or not fire gas, a clear threshold, a visible crime. Bari was uglier than that. The weapon did not have to be deliberately deployed at enemy troops to do exactly what it was built to do. It only had to exist nearby in quantity. 2,000 bombs in a crowded harbor were enough. The ban pushed the weapon out of open doctrine, but not out of war. It came back through storage, secrecy, and accident. There is one more twist here. Alexander's investigation, the same one that cut through the censorship, helped clarify how mustard damaged rapidly dividing cells, especially blood-forming tissues. That line of research would later feed into work on nitrogen mustard chemotherapy. So one of the dirtiest hidden chemical incidents of the war also produced medical knowledge that would later be redirected toward cancer treatment. Not redemption, just one of history's colder ironies. In Bari, none of that future mattered to the men in the wards with their eyes bandaged shut. They had not been told there was gas. The doctors had not been told there was gas. And the harbor kept delivering the dose long after the bombs had burst. The shell is the easy part to outlaw. The stockpile is harder. The reserve is harder. The secret sitting offshore because leaders want deterrence without confession is harder still. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 drew a line against use, but it left enough room for ships like John Harvey to sail with poison in their holds. Only much later, on April 29, 1997, did the Chemical Weapons Convention move past that old half measure and ban development, production, acquisition, stockpiling, retention, transfer, and use. It finally came for the reserve itself. But in 1943, that reserve was floating in Bari. When it blew, the deadliest part was not the blast. It was the delay. Men survived the raid, walked into hospital, and only then discovered what had really touched them. As one contemporary summary put it, The victims had been exposed to a poisonous substance in the water and oil. Number 5. Japanese Red No. 1 arsenical gas shells. On July 6, 1939, a Japanese frontline gas unit in Shaanxi province wrote down exactly what it was doing. Not in the language of poison, but in code. A Chinese machine gun position ahead. 31 red shells assigned to it. The Geneva Protocol had already been on the books for 14 years. The page stayed clean. This hillside did not. Dawn comes up gray over the broken hills. The earth is chalky, cut by trenches and mule tracks, and the machine gun has the road pinned. Every approach is exposed. Men trying to cross flatten themselves behind stone walls and scrub. So the mortar crew comes forward with its tubes, base plates, ammunition boxes, and sealed rounds marked only by color. Red. Not blood red in the open. Red in the ledger. Red in the system. A word that lets everyone handle the thing without naming it. You are beside the position as the order passes down. Range checked. Angle corrected. The shell drops down the tube with a hollow metallic note. One goes first, then another, then a string of them, lifting over the ridge in fast, neat arcs. 31 in total for that one machine gun nest. They do not land like high explosive. The burst is smaller. The cloud is what matters. At first it looks thin, easy to wave off. A little dust kicked up around a firing slit, a puff breaking low against rocks. Then the wind takes it. It slips into the trench line and under the lip of cover. Men who were staying down still have to breathe. Red No. 1 starts working there. The agent behind the code was an arsenical sternutator, compounds like diphenylcyanoarsine and related arsenic-based irritants. Chemistry matters less than what it does. Your nose and throat flare first. Then the coughing starts. Hard, dry, violent, sneezing, chest pain, eyes clamping shut, mucus pouring, nausea hitting in a wave so sudden it folds you. Then vomiting, not from weakness. Your body is trying to expel a battlefield that got in through the one route it cannot seal. A machine gun runs on rhythm, hands on feed, eye on sight, breath under control. This cloud wrecks that rhythm one reflex at a time. The gun that had been stitching the road now stutters. Someone crawls backward from the embrasure, clawing at his face. Another tries to keep his mask on and doubles over anyway, retching into it. This kind of shell does not have to kill you in place. It only has to make the position impossible to hold. Some accounts after the war tried to place weapons like this in a softer category, as if sneeze gas were somehow less real than blister agents or lung agents. Inside the trench, it feels like nothing soft at all. Your body is locking up. Your weapon is slipping. Your sealed pocket of resistance is turning into a chamber of coughs, vomit, and panic. The position opens because the defenders can no longer stay inside it. The report discovered decades later by historian Seiya Matsuno catches only a slice of that morning. A machine gun position. 31 red shells. But the same Shaanxi operation recorded something larger. The 5th Mortar Battalion fired 231 red bombs and 48 yellow bombs. Red to drive men out, yellow for blister agents. Different colors in the log. On the ground, the order is what matters. One shell forces you from cover. The next punishes you for leaving it. One attacks discipline. The next attacks skin, eyes, and lungs. That is how an incapacitating weapon becomes a trap. The crew loading these rounds did not invent them in the field. Their work began far from Shaanxi, on a small island in the inland sea. Okunoshima. Poison gas plants were built there in 1929. By around 1932, the island had been removed from local maps to preserve secrecy. Trace the chain backward. A shell bursts over a trench in China. Filling lines operate elsewhere. Poison is manufactured on an island the public is not supposed to see. Crated, shipped, stored, carried inland, hauled up these roads by men who may know only the color painted on the munition in front of them. Back at the Chinese position, none of that matters inside the cloud. One man is on his knees, trying to suck air through cloth gone wet with saliva and vomit. Another has already stripped off his mask because the pressure in his chest feels worse with it on. Because every instinct says, get this thing off, get open air, get anything. But the open air is where the shell is. The trench wall is where the shell is. The firing step, the parapet, the coat sleeve across your mouth, all of it is where the shell is. Once the dust settles, you cannot outguess a vapor you cannot see. The mortar team keeps working. Drop, thump, arc, burst. A coded barrage delivered as methodically as any conventional fire mission. The gun position that blocked the road an hour ago is no longer a position in the military sense. It is a place where bodies are trying not to betray themselves and failing. The line wavers. Somebody runs, somebody else crawls. The machine gun is still there, but control of it is gone. Was the purpose. Not a dramatic green cloud rolling across no man's land. Not a scientist's demonstration. A local, tactical problem solved with chemistry. A stubborn nest on high ground. A road under fire. 31 shells to make men cough, sneeze, retch, stumble, tear at their masks, and abandon the patch of earth they had held. The report records the result in cold language. It never needs to describe the sound. But the sound sits in the scene anyway. Coughing over coughing. Men trying to shout through spasms. Metal clattering from hands that cannot grip anymore. The machine gun goes irregular, then silent. The red rounds do what they were built to do. The defenders start coming out. Behind that coded bombardment, another set of shells is already on the way. Number 4. Japanese yellow No. 1 blister gas shells. In July 1939, historian Seiya Matsuno was not on a battlefield. He was in an archive, following paper. The paper led back to Shaanxi province, to one Japanese chemical warfare unit, one firing mission, and one line so cold it almost hides what it means. Matsuno identified a detailed battle report from the 5th Mortar Battalion of Japan's chemical forces. In that action, the unit recorded firing 231 red rounds and 48 yellow rounds. Red meant irritant and vomiting agents. Yellow meant blister agents. That family included Japanese yellow No. 1 mustard shells. When the yellow rounds were used, the men who launched them wrote that the first bombardment achieved very good effects. This phrase matters because it is not testimony pulled from survivors decades later. It is not a prosecutor's summary. It is the firing unit judging its own work. By 1939, Japan was not operating in legal confusion. It had signed the 1925 Geneva Protocol. Older Hague rules had already forbidden poison weapons. In China, against an enemy with little ability to answer in kind, the coded shells kept coming anyway. Matsuno's find is powerful because it is so dry. No screaming, no adjectives, just inventory, sequence, result. That is how these weapons often survive on paper, not as horror, as administration. 231 red bombs, 48 yellow bombs. A battlefield effect noted like range or weather. Slow it down and the numbers stop looking abstract. 48 mortar-delivered blister rounds is not a warning shot. It is a decision. A deliberate shift from making men cough and retch to making the ground itself punish contact. You can hear the sequence in it. Red shells break the defense. Yellow shells make staying broken dangerous. One drives men out of cover. The other contaminates the cover, the parapet, the path behind it, the equipment they grab to retreat. After the blast, the shell keeps working. That was the logic of blister weapons everywhere. Here it appears in miniature, almost clinically. First discomfort, then damage. First disruption, then denial. Not just to kill, to make a position unusable. And the label yellow did not mean what the men under fire would have seen in the air. It was not a nickname based on smoke. It was part of an internal color code system. Yellow for blister agents, red for vomiting agents, blue for phosgene, brown for hydrogen cyanide. A neat filing system for poison. The most revealing word in the report is not even effects. It is yellow. One coded color turned a battlefield event into something half-hidden, even in its own record. Seiya Matsuno spent years tracing that kind of evidence because directed missions are rare. Armies destroy files, governments narrow definitions, memory erodes. But this one report stayed. Because it stayed, we can see one operation at human scale. Somewhere in Shanxi, a mortar crew set its tubes, checked angles, and dropped round after round into the base plate rhythm every artilleryman knows. Somewhere downrange, soldiers who had already been forced out by red shells were hit with something worse. The report does not name them. It only measures outcome. Very good effects. 4 words. The moral collapse of chemical warfare compressed into staff language. Matsuno's story does not end in 1939, because the yellow rounds did not end there either. Decades after the war, the same category of Japanese chemical munitions began surfacing underground in China. Not in museums, in excavation sites, in construction zones, in burial pits opened by accident and then by specialists. Recovered Japanese yellow shells included 75mm rounds weighing 5 to 6 kilograms, 105mm rounds weighing around 16, and 150mm shells weighing 32. Rusted, corroded, leaking, still dangerous. People miss this about outlawed weapons. Banning them does not make them stop existing. It changes where they wait. Yellow shells were especially good at waiting. Scientific analysis of abandoned Japanese yellow shells found that after nearly 60 years, mustard and lewisite were still there as major components. In one analyzed fill, the contents were roughly 43% mustard and 55% lewisite. Even when the casing had rotted and the labels were gone, the chemistry remained. That creates a strange problem in Matsuno's 1939 document. The wartime report calls them yellow rounds, and Japanese official descriptions classify yellow munitions as blister agent weapons containing mustard and/or lewisite. Yellow number 1 was the mustard type. Yellow number 2 was lewisite. Later recovered shells often show mixtures of the two. So what exactly landed in Shanxi in July 1939? Pure yellow number 1 mustard? A mixed fill? A field category recorded only by color? The document is vivid enough to prove use, but not precise enough to settle composition. That uncertainty is part of the story. Concealment worked on more than one level. First in the battlefield code, archive, then in the ground itself. By the end of World War II, the scale of abandonment was immense. One estimate for hairballing alone put the number at 674,000 chemical bombs, including yellow shells. And as of April 3, 2023, Japan had declared 98,293 abandoned chemical weapons in China and destroyed 65,894 of them under the Chemical Weapons Convention process. Tens of thousands accounted for. Tens of thousands processed. Then you go back to one man reading one report and finding one sentence that should never have existed. These weapons were already constrained by the Hague Rules and the Geneva Protocol. Poison had been pushed outside acceptable war. In Shanxi, a Japanese battalion still fired 48 yellow rounds, watched blister casualties hit an enemy that could not respond in kind, and wrote down the result as very good effects. Officially banned, operationally useful, then buried, and still in the soil. Number 3. Carbon monoxide gas vans. On January 19, 1942, Schlama Bear Weiner squeezed through a small window and ran for his life from Helmno in German-occupied Poland. 13 days earlier, on January 6th, he had arrived there as a deported Polish Jew. By then, the killing center had been operating for barely a month. It began on December 8, 1941, after a first transport of about 700 Jews from Koło arrived on December 7th. Weiner was not sent straight to death. He was forced into the forest labor detail at Zhuchów, where the system ended. He saw the part the killers wanted hidden. Trucks arrived, doors opened, Bodies were dragged out. The floor was washed down. Another load was already coming. The sensational version turns gas vans into some secret miracle of industrial killing. The evidence is uglier than that and more mechanical. Start with the vehicle. At Helmno, there were 3 of them from December 1941 onward. 2 medium Renault trucks and 1 larger truck. From the outside, they were made to look ordinary, even useful, like furniture delivery vans. In other areas, later instructions called for shutters so they would resemble rural house trailers. Not armored monsters, not a futuristic death machine. Sealed cargo bodies on truck frames, disguised just well enough to pass at a glance. Now the compartment. Roughly 13 to 15 feet long, about 6.75 feet wide, about 6.5 feet high. Big enough to pack in 50 to 70 people at a time. The victims reached it through a requisitioned manor house. They were told they were going to wash. They undressed. They were driven down a boarded passage and forced into the rear. Then the doors were locked. Killing agent was not a special battlefield shell. It was not a cylinder of exotic poison. It was engine exhaust. Carbon monoxide was fed from the truck's own exhaust into the sealed compartment while the van drove to the forest. In descriptions of the cycle, once the motor was switched on, death took about 10 minutes. The mechanism was brutally simple. A truck, a sealed box, a hose or pipe rerouting exhaust. Distance became a weapon. The road itself became part of the killing process. The drive from the manor to the burial site gave the engine enough time to do the work before the doors opened again. Simple did not mean clean. It did not mean hidden. On May 16, 1942, an SS chemist named August Becker wrote to Walter Rauff about gas van problems on the Eastern Front. Read that letter closely, and the myth falls apart, line by line. Becker was not describing a flawless system. He was complaining about defects, secrecy failures, and the behavior of the men operating the vans. Drivers, he wrote, tended to floor the accelerator. Picture what that did inside the compartment. Too much gas, too fast, did not produce a neat death. It produced visible distress, violent physical reactions, a scene that made the unloading crew's work worse. Becker's fix was not moral. It was technical. Drive more carefully, adjust the handling, make the process look calmer. The goal was not to save the victims. The goal was to make killing easier for the perpetrators. This is some of the clearest evidence for what these vans really were. They were presented, even inside the system, as a way to reduce the psychological burden on shooters. No firing squad. No line of men pulling triggers at close range. But Becker's letter shows the burden did not vanish. It shifted. Men unloading the bodies complained of headaches. Civilians had started recognizing the vehicles as death vans. The disguise was failing. The process left traces on drivers, on witnesses, and on the road. If the myth is a perfectly secret murder vehicle, the evidence says otherwise. People learned what these trucks meant. Operators had to be coached. And the deadliest part of the whole system came straight from a combustion engine. That detail matters in the larger story. The weapons that proved most useful were often the ones states tried hardest to ban or bury. Worked best did not always mean sophisticated. Sometimes it meant available, deniable, and easy to fit into machinery already in place. A truck can enter a village without looking like artillery. A truck can close its doors without sounding like a firing squad. A truck can turn a poison banned in war into an administrative routine. Legally, this sat in a grim gray area of method and setting, but not of substance. The Geneva Protocol of June 17, 1925, prohibited the use in war of asphyxiating, poisonous, or other gases. These vans were not battlefield weapons in the way gas shells were. They were instruments of mass murder used against civilians and prisoners. But the agent at the center of the system was still an asphyxiating toxic gas. The ban pushed poison outside acceptable combat. It did not erase poison from the imagination of states that wanted killing without witnesses. At Helmno, that logic scaled fast. The site operated in 2 phases, from December 1941 to April 1943, and again from June 1944 to January 1945. At least 156,300 people were murdered there, at least 152,000 Jews, and about 4,300 Roma. The exact total is still unresolved because the SS destroyed records, mobile killing left fewer permanent traces, and surviving testimony catches only fragments. Even the minimum shows what the van really was. Not an experiment, not a side note, a production tool. Weiner understood that before almost anyone outside did. He watched the cycle from the end point. Van arrives, doors open, bodies out, interior cleaned. Next load follows. Then he learned the grave diggers themselves would be killed. So on January 19th, he escaped and carried the first detailed warning from Helmno to Jewish underground contacts. That warning was not built from rumor. It came from sequence, repetition, and close-range observation. From a witness looking at a truck and understanding that its most important feature was not the metal, or the brand, or the engine size, but what happened in the sealed dark behind the cab. 3 vans, 50 to 70 people inside each load, around 10 minutes with the motor running. A manor house at one end, a forest at the other. In paperwork and camouflage, it could still resemble transport. Then the doors swung open, the air spilled out. The truck had done its work. Number 2. Zyklon B gas chambers. On September 3, 1941, in the basement of Block 11 at Auschwitz, Karl Fritsch turned a camp chemical into a killing method. Rudolf Huss was away. Fritsch, the deputy commandant, had about 600 Soviet prisoners of war and about 250 sick Polish prisoners from the camp hospital forced into sealed cells below the prison block. The product was Zyklon B. Until then, at Auschwitz, it had been used for disinfection and pest control. That first number matters. Not a shell, not an artillery round. A commercial delousing agent, repurposed inside a locked building. The dating is narrow, but not perfectly clean. Sources point to a smaller trial in late August 1941, probably on 20 to 30 Soviet POWs in the same Block 11 basement. Then came the larger killing on September 3rd. The deaths stretched over roughly 2 days. The method did not appear at full speed. It was tested, measured, repeated. The numbers show the change. First, 20 to 30, then 850. A method moving from proof of concept to operating procedure. Start with the treaty. June 17, 1925, Geneva. The protocol prohibited the use in war of asphyxiating, poisonous, or other gases. By the time Fritsch carried Zyklon B into Block 11, poison gas already belonged to a banned category. But the ban was written for war between states, for battlefields, for shells crossing trenches. Auschwitz was built outside that frame. No front line, no warning, no return fire. The legal category stayed the same. The setting changed from open ground to sealed rooms. When poison moved indoors, counting became the forensic trail. Block 11 was not designed as a grand killing center. That is a clue. Basement cells were improvised for the first large-scale gassing at Auschwitz. The victims were packed in. The doors were shut. Zyklon B released hydrogen cyanide. No blast mark, no crater, no shell fragments to collect. The evidence is logistical instead of ballistic. Room, seal, dose, time, bodies. Almost no battlefield signature, because this was never meant for a battlefield. The first known Auschwitz victims of Zyklon B were not the Jewish deportees most people now associate with the camp. They were Soviet POWs and sick Polish prisoners. That sequence matters. The technique was tested on one prisoner group before it became the central murder technology used above all against another. Industrial killing at Auschwitz did not appear all at once, fully formed. The dates show the progression. Late August 1941. September 3, 1941. Spring 1943. In less than 2 years, a poison trial in a basement became a system anchored in purpose-built gas chambers and crematoria at Birkenau. By 1942 and 1943, the arithmetic had moved far beyond one prison block. Auschwitz-Birkenau turned hydrogen cyanide from Zyklon B pellets into its main killing technology for mass murder, especially of Jews deported from across Europe. The site-wide total is about 1.1 million dead. Around 1 million were Jews. About 70,000 were Poles. About 21,000 were Roma and Sinti. About 15,000 were Soviet POWs. These figures do not describe a side method. They describe the center of the machine. Count gas chamber rooms across Nazi killing sites and related facilities, room by room, and the total rises to more than 80. More than 80 rooms. Not clouds drifting over trenches, not canisters lobbed in panic. Rooms, spaces, measured volumes, doors that close, ventilation planned in advance. The shape of the crime changes with that number. Once poison is tied to architecture, murder becomes infrastructure. You can trace that shift inside Auschwitz itself. The earlier gas chamber at Auschwitz I remained in use only until spring 1943. Then it was withdrawn after the newer Birkenau crematoria and gas chambers came into operation. The camp did not merely adopt poison, it optimized around it. One facility gave way to another because the later one could process more. The coldest number is not how many died in one room. It is the fact that one room could be replaced by a more efficient set of rooms. Strip the scene down to mechanics. A sealed chamber, pellets introduced, hydrogen cyanide released. Minutes pass, then silence. Then labor crews, then removal, then ventilation. Then the chamber is ready again. The process looks nothing like a shell burst, but it answers the same question running through this whole story. The weapons they tried hardest to ban or bury were often the ones that gave the most control. Not control at the front, indoor control, timed control, bureaucratic control. A poison ordered under another name and deployed behind walls. One more detail sits in the chemistry. Hydrogen cyanide, the lethal gas released from Zyklon B, is today listed under Schedule 3 of the Chemical Weapons Convention's Chemicals Annex. The molecule did not change. The law kept following it. Different decades, different institutions, same recognition. This is poison with a history. The crime at Auschwitz was not the discovery of a new war gas. The folding of an existing commercial product into a mass-killing system so tightly that the room itself became the weapon. The earliest operational sequence is still blurred at the edges. Historians can separate the probable late August test from the larger September 3rd killing, but not every detail survives in a clean line. The SS destroyed records. Survivors saw fragments. Camp documentation catches pieces, not the whole mechanism. Yet the surviving numbers are enough. 20 to 30 in the first probable test. About 850 in the first large killing. Spring 1943 for the handoff to Birkenau. About 1.1 million dead at Auschwitz overall. More than 80 gas chamber rooms across the larger system. The pattern is visible even where the paperwork is not. Zyklon B differed from the gas weapons banned in 1925 in one crucial way. On a battlefield, poison moves with weather, terrain, masks, and chance. In a chamber, those variables are stripped away one by one. The victims cannot run. The gas cannot drift off target. The walls do the aiming. The door does the trapping. The building finishes the work. It began in Block 11, with a pesticide and 850 prisoners. Then, the building took over. Number 1. Unit 731 Plague Flea Bombs. On October 27, 1940, warning sirens sounded over Ningbo in Zhejiang, and the city prepared for a normal air raid. People expected blast damage, fire, shrapnel, the familiar logic of bombing. In the morning, Japanese aircraft dropped leaflets instead. Paper drifted through the streets, a nuisance, maybe a warning, maybe psychological warfare. Then, around 2 p.m., a single plane came back over Kaiming Street, and released something stranger. Grain, flour, and cotton-like scraps falling into an ordinary Chinese neighborhood. No dramatic detonation, no crater, no wall blown open. Just a mess in the street, the kind of debris civilians might sweep aside by evening. Inside that quiet scene were different numbers. About 2 kilograms, 4.4 pounds, of plague bacteria spread over the city. Roughly 5,000 fleas per ceramic bomb load in the Unit 731 system, with 10 bombs carried by a plane, according to museum reconstructions. Between 1937 and 1942, about 2,000 ceramic bombs were produced for this program. This was not one ugly experiment at the edge of the war. It was an industrial method built around a simple idea. If heat and blast kill the biological payload, remove the blast. Use ceramic, not metal. Let the casing break with less heat. Leave fewer obvious fragments. Keep the living part alive. In the most literal sense, the deadliest weapon dropped on Ningbo that day was not a shell at all. It was a release mechanism for tiny animals already carrying disease. Everything people did next could become part of the attack without them knowing it. Fleas do not stay where they land. Rats do not respect district lines. Food scraps do not look military. Civilians in a city under stress do what civilians always do. They walk, they sweep, they touch, they carry things home. The battlefield was no longer the street where the plane passed overhead. It spread into kitchens, courtyards, storage rooms, bedding, grain sacks, clothing, and markets. If plague fleas were dispersed over Kaiming Street that afternoon, Ningbo was not facing one strike. It was facing a chain reaction built out of daily life. Within days, plague cases appeared. The response shows how quickly the authorities understood what they were dealing with. They did not only count the sick, they tried to quarantine a neighborhood. A 4.3-meter isolation wall went up around the infected district. Patients were separated from suspected cases. Eventually, the affected street area was burned to stop transmission. That is an extreme measure. You do not build a wall through a city block and set part of the city on fire because of debris from a conventional bomb. You do it because the threat is now in the spaces between people. The legal ban comes into focus here. The 1925 Geneva Protocol, in force from February 8, 1928, prohibited bacteriological methods of warfare. On Kaiming Street, that meant something physical and immediate. A banned weapon could turn civilians into vectors, homes into reservoirs, and the ordinary ecology of a city into the delivery system. It did not need to keep exploding after impact. The disease would travel for it. You can see why armies would want that. You can also see why they moved to ban it so early. Most weapons kill where they land. This one kills where people flee, where they gather, where they try to recover. It follows the routines that keep a city alive. Some outlawed weapons were banned because they were cruel. Others were banned because they worked too well outside the battlefield. Shiro Ishii's program at Unit 731, working with Unit 1644, was built around that kind of efficiency. Not artillery accuracy, contamination. The payload did not need to punch through armor. It needed to survive dispersal, find hosts, and let biology continue the attack after the aircraft was gone. Ceramic bombs mattered for that reason. A metal casing asked the wrong thing from the weapon. Too much force, too much heat, too much destruction at the moment of release. A plague flea bomb was not meant to destroy its contents. It was meant to deliver them alive. Because the delivery looked so ordinary, the first moments were almost perversely quiet. Grain, flour, cotton-like material. The sort of scene that would not announce itself as a war crime to the people standing underneath it. That is what makes this feel like the peak of the segment. Dum-dums deform on impact. Gas shells announce themselves through smell, smoke, blisters, choking. Chambers reveal themselves through walls, doors, and machinery. Here, the weapon arrived disguised as clutter. The accounting afterward is one of the most disturbing parts. One set of figures lists 112 plague cases over 39 days, from late October to December 7th. Another figure, 1,554 deaths, includes first and second round infections in later accounting. The exact boundary between direct victims and epidemic victims is still disputed. But the dispute itself matters. It's not about whether the attack happened. It is about where the attack stops. Does the weapon end when the plane leaves? When the first patients die? When infected fleas move to rats? When secondary infections begin? With a biological weapon, casualty counting becomes forensic work inside a spreading event. The bomb falls once. The consequences keep finding their own route. Picture Kaiming Street that afternoon. No crater, no massive blast. Scattered grain and lint-like scraps in the road. Children point at it. Shopkeepers curse the mess. Someone sweeps it toward a doorway. If the reports are right, that tiny act of cleanup is now part of the delivery system. The object dropped from the plane was only the opening move. The city finishes the attack itself. This weapon sits at the far end of the banned list for a reason. It recruited vermin, traffic, hunger, habit, and time. Not a bomb in the ordinary sense, a seed for an epidemic. And the people on the ground understood the horror in the plainest possible language. One later account of the emergency measures in Ningbo reduces the scene to a line with no rhetoric left in it. The whole street was burned.